Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
The ICU in Houston was unnaturally quiet for a place designed to fight death. The lights above were too white, too clean, casting a pale glow over the small body lying on the hospital bed. Machines surrounded him, each one blinking, humming, and beeping in a steady rhythm that felt almost cruel in its calm. Beep, pause, beep, pause. As if the room itself was counting down something no one dared to say out loud. Mason Reed was 12 years old. He looked smaller than he should have, swallowed by the stiff hospital sheets and the tubes taped to his skin. His face was wrapped in layers of white gauze, leaving only his closed eyes visible. A thin plastic tube rose and fell with each assisted breath. If you didn't know better, you might have thought he was asleep, peaceful, resting. But nothing about this room was peaceful. A doctor stood near the foot of the bed, holding a tablet that displayed a series of black and white images. CT scans. He stared at them longer than felt normal. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. No words, no instructions, just silence. The kind of silence that makes your chest tighten, because you can feel that something is wrong before anyone says it. Across the room, Mason's father, Tyler Reed, stood frozen. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes moved from the doctor's face to the bandages on his son's cheek, then to the heart monitor, as if trying to understand how all of this could belong to the same story. How a boy who had gone to school a few days ago could now be lying here surrounded by machines. This started, the doctor finally said, his voice low and measured, with an infection. Tyler nodded automatically, even though his mind was screaming. An infection? That word felt too small, too ordinary. People got infections all the time. Kids got scrapes, bug bites, pimples. They healed. They moved on. That's what Tyler had always believed. The doctor hesitated, then added quietly, "It spread fast, much faster than anyone would expect." Another pause, another stretch of silence that pressed down on the room. "It reached the bone," the doctor said. Tyler felt the floor tilt beneath him. "The bone?" he repeated, as if saying the word again might change its meaning. The doctor nodded. "The jawbone. We're dealing with a deep infection and signs of sepsis. We're preparing for emergency surgery. Emergency. Surgery. Sepsis." Each word landed heavily, stacking on top of the last until Tyler could barely breathe. This was an ICU. This was where people came when time had run out. And yet, just days ago, Mason had been walking around the house quietly, doing his homework, eating his meals without complaint. He hadn't cried. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't begged to see a doctor. He hadn't made a sound. Tyler's gaze drifted back to his son's face, to the thick bandage covering his cheek. Somewhere beneath that gauze was the place where it had all begun. Not with a car accident, not with a rare disease, but with something so small, so common, that no one thought it could matter. A pimple. The heart monitor beeped again, steady and indifferent. Beep, pause. Beep. Tyler swallowed hard, a sick realization forming in his mind, one he didn't yet have the courage to fully face. This wasn't just about bacteria or bad luck. It wasn't even just about medicine. This was about everything that hadn't been said, because the thing that had nearly killed Mason Reed wasn't just an infection spreading under his skin. It was the silence that had surrounded him long before he ever reached this hospital bed. A silence that had taught a 12-year-old boy that pain was something to endure quietly, that asking for help was the same as causing trouble, that being noticed was dangerous. The machines kept counting time. And standing there in the ICU, watching his son fight for his life, Tyler began to understand something that terrified him more than any diagnosis. By the time a child stops crying, it's often because they've learned that no one is listening. The truth about Mason Reed was that most people thought he was easy. Teachers described him as polite and quiet. Neighbors said he was well-behaved. Even Tyler, his own father, often told people, "He's a good kid, never gives me any trouble." And Mason learned, very early on, that this sentence was not just a compliment, it was a standard, one he was expected to live up to. Mason was small for his age, with narrow shoulders and limbs that still looked like they belonged to a younger child. He had a habit of keeping his head slightly lowered when he walked, not out of fear exactly, but out of practice. It made him easier to disappear, His voice, when he spoke, was soft enough that people sometimes asked him to repeat himself, though he rarely did. He preferred not to take up space. Long before the hospital, long before the bandages and machines, Mason had learned an important lesson about the world around him. Attention was not free. It came at a cost. If you asked for too much of it, you paid for it later. In the Reed household, mornings were quiet. Tyler left early for work, his coffee mug in one hand, his phone in the other. He kissed Mason on the top of the head most days, a quick, distracted gesture, already half gone. Mason learned to pack his own backpack, pour his own cereal, and make sure the door was locked behind him. These were small things, but they added up. Independence was praised, need was inconvenient. At school, Mason sat near the back of the classroom, not because he couldn't see the board, but because it felt safer there. When teachers asked questions, his hand stayed down, even when he knew the answer. Being wrong was embarrassing, but being noticed was worse. He watched other kids raise their hands eagerly, interrupt, laugh loudly. He wondered how they did it without feeling that tightness in their chest. There were times when Mason felt pain before the pimple ever appeared. Headaches that lingered too long, a stomach that twisted itself into knots before school, a heaviness that settled behind his eyes when the house felt tense. But these things were invisible, and invisible pain was easier to ignore. After the divorce, that lesson only deepened. The shouting had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was sharper. Tyler tried to keep things normal. He made sure Mason got to school on time. Dinner appeared on the table most nights. Bills were paid. From the outside it looked like stability. From the inside it felt like walking on thin ice. Mason learned to study his father's moods the way some kids studied weather patterns. If Tyler's jaw was tight and his answers were short, it was a day to stay quiet. If he seemed lighter, distracted but calm, Mason might risk a sentence or two. Never too much, never anything that sounded like a complaint. When Brooke entered their lives, Mason adjusted again. At first he tried harder. He cleaned up after himself without being asked. He kept his shoes lined up neatly by the door. He did his homework at the kitchen table so it would be visible, proof that he wasn't slacking. He wanted to be good. Not because he expected love as a reward, but because he feared what happened when people decided you were a problem. Brooke's rules were unspoken, but Mason learned them quickly. Noise was frowned upon. Questions were interruptions. Pain, unless it was obvious and dramatic, was suspicious. When Mason once mentioned a headache, Brooke barely looked up from her phone. "You're fine," she said. "Don't start." That sentence stayed with him. Children like Mason do not suddenly decide to hide their pain. They are trained into it, one small moment at a time. Each dismissal teaches them that their body cannot be trusted. Each sigh teaches them that speaking up creates tension. Eventually, silence feels safer than honesty. By the time the pimple appeared on his cheek, Mason was already fluent in silence. He noticed it early, a small, tender bump beneath the skin, redder than the rest of his face. He stood in the bathroom one morning, staring at his reflection longer than usual. Most kids would have worried about how it looked. Mason worried about what it meant. Pain, to him, was not just a physical sensation. It was a risk. He thought about telling his father. Tyler was kind, in his own way, but Mason also knew his father was tired, busy, trying to hold his life together. Bringing up something small felt selfish. He imagined Tyler waving it off. "It's just a pimple. You'll be fine." He thought about telling Brooke. The idea made his stomach tighten. He could already hear her voice. "Don't be dramatic. Don't make a big deal out of nothing." So Mason did what he always did. He said nothing. Instead, he adjusted. He turned his face slightly away when people spoke to him. He pulled his hoodie higher, even when the Houston heat clung to his skin. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck, but he didn't complain. Complaining had never made anything better. At school, a classmate pointed it out. "What's that on your face?" Mason shrugged. "Nothing." The word came out automatically, smooth from years of practice. What no one saw was how often Mason checked the mirror, how carefully he monitored the pain, as if measuring it might keep it under control. What no one knew was that inside his quiet 12-year-old mind, a calculation was constantly running. Is this bad enough to be worth the trouble? For Mason, the answer was almost always no. There is a dangerous misunderstanding many adults carry, especially those who grew up believing toughness was a virtue. They assume that children will always speak up when something is wrong. That pain announces itself loudly. That silence means comfort. But children like Mason do not cry when they are hurt. They wait. They wait because they've learned that love is conditional. That peace in the house depends on their ability to be low maintenance. That being easy is the same as being safe. And so Mason waited, as the tenderness deepened, as the heat under his skin grew stronger, as his body began fighting a battle he did not understand and did not feel allowed to interrupt. By the time the pain became impossible to ignore, Mason was already trapped by the habits that had kept him alive emotionally for years, habits that would soon put his life in real danger. The night Mason understood that families could break was loud. It started with voices, raised voices, not shouting at first but sharp enough to cut through the walls of his bedroom. Mason sat up in bed, the blanket pooled around his waist, listening. He knew those tones. He had heard them before, muted, restrained, always stopping just short of something worse. This time, they didn't stop. Tyler's voice came first, low and tight, the sound of a man trying not to explode. Hannah's followed, higher, trembling, breaking in places Mason had never heard before. Words collided with each other, spilling out too fast to fully understand, but some of them stuck. Explain this. It's not what you think. How long? I was lonely. Mason slipped out of bed and opened his door just enough to see the hallway. The lights were on downstairs. Shadows moved across the walls. He padded quietly to the top of the stairs and sat down, hugging his knees, hidden just enough to not be seen. He didn't know why he stayed. Some instinct told him not to leave. Another told him not to interrupt. Adults, he had learned, hated interruptions. The argument grew louder. Tyler's restraint snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted. Hannah cried then, not softly, not politely. She begged. Mason had never heard his mother beg before. It frightened him more than the yelling. Parents were supposed to be solid, unmovable. Hearing her voice crack made something inside him wobble. "I made a mistake," she said. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Please, Tyler, please." Mason pressed his forehead against the stair rail. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the feeling. Something important was being pulled apart, something that could not be put back the same way. Tyler's footsteps echoed across the living room. A door slammed, then another. When he spoke again, his voice was raw. "Get out," he said. "I don't want you in this house." There was a long pause, the kind that stretches painfully, daring someone to fill it. "What about Mason?" Hannah asked. For a moment no one spoke. Mason's heart pounded so hard he was afraid they might hear it upstairs. "We'll figure that out later," Tyler said. "Right now, I need you gone." Those words burned themselves into Mason's memory. "We'll figure that out later," as if he were a detail, a problem to be addressed after the real damage was handled. Hannah came up the stairs then. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen. When she saw Mason sitting there, frozen on the steps, she stopped. For a second, she looked like she might collapse. "Oh, honey," she whispered. Mason didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't run to her. He stayed exactly where he was, his body locked in place. His mind had gone strangely quiet, as if someone had turned the volume down inside his head. Hannah knelt in front of him and reached, but hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch him anymore. That hesitation hurt more than anything else. "It's going to be okay," she said, though her voice didn't believe it. "Mommy and Daddy we're just talking." Mason nodded because that seemed like the correct response. He didn't trust his voice. If he opened his mouth, something uncontrollable might come out. Fear, anger, questions no one wanted to answer. That night, Hannah packed a bag. Mason watched from the hallway as she folded clothes with shaking hands. Tyler stayed downstairs. They didn't look at each other again. When Hannah finally left, the house felt different, quieter, but not calm, empty in a way Mason couldn't explain. He stood by the front door long after it closed, staring at the spot where his mother had been seconds earlier. Tyler found him there. "Go to bed," Tyler said, his voice tired, not unkind but distant. Mason obeyed. He always did. The days that followed blurred together. Hannah was suddenly absent, reduced to phone calls and brief visits that felt awkward and strained. Tyler tried to keep things moving. School, meals, routine, as if structure alone could patch the hole that had opened in their lives. Mason learned quickly not to ask questions. Every time Hannah's name came up, Tyler's shoulders stiffened, his patience thinned. Mason didn't want to be another source of stress. He swallowed his curiosity, his confusion, his grief. At night, alone in his room, he replayed the argument over and over, trying to make sense of it. He wondered if he could have done something differently, if he had been louder, better, easier. Children are experts at blaming themselves for things they cannot control. The custody hearing came months later. Mason sat in a chair outside a courtroom, his feet dangling above the floor. Adults walked past him carrying folders and serious expressions. No one asked him how he felt. No one asked where he wanted to live. When the decision was made, Tyler won full custody. Hannah was granted limited visitation. People congratulated Tyler. They said it was better for stability, for consistency. Mason nodded when he was told. Stability sounded good, consistency sounded safe. But something inside him quietly broke when he realized what the ruling meant. His mother would no longer be there when he woke up. She wouldn't be there at night. Her presence in his life would be scheduled, monitored, rationed. He didn't cry in the courthouse. He didn't cry in the car. He didn't cry when they got home. Instead, Mason did what many children do when the ground beneath them shifts too suddenly. He shut down. He became careful, more careful than before. He watched his father closely, sensing the grief and anger Tyler carried like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. Mason learned that mentioning his mother was dangerous territory, so he stopped. He learned that emotions made adults uncomfortable, so he hid his. Adults often mistake this kind of behavior for resilience. They say things like, "He's handling it so well." They admire the child who doesn't act out, who doesn't scream or demand attention. What they don't see is the cost. When a child realizes that their pain has no place to land, they don't stop feeling it, they just bury it. Deep, so deep that even they forget it's there. By the time Tyler remarried, Mason had already mastered the art of emotional invisibility. He knew how to make himself small, how to disappear into the background of his own life. So when something hurt, really hurt, Mason didn't think of asking for help. He thought of staying quiet. Because the worst lesson Mason learned during his parents' divorce was not that people could leave, it was that his pain came second. And once a child believes that, silence becomes a survival skill. Brooke Reed entered Mason's life quietly, the way permanent changes often do. At first, she was just a presence, a woman who laughed a little too brightly when Tyler told a joke, a woman who brought over dinner in neat containers and said things like, "I just want to help." Mason watched her from the edge of the room. Polite, cautious, already adjusting. He had learned that new adults required careful observation. In the beginning, Brooke made an effort. She asked Mason about school. She smiled often when Tyler was around. She touched Mason's shoulder lightly when she passed him in the hallway, a gesture that looked warm from the outside. Tyler noticed these things and felt relieved. He wanted this to work. He wanted to believe that bringing Brooke into their lives meant moving forward. What Mason noticed was different. He noticed how Brooke's smile faded the moment Tyler left the room, how her voice changed, dropping its softness like a coat she no longer needed. He noticed how she sighed when he entered the kitchen, how her eyes flicked toward him with something close to annoyance, quickly masked. These were small things, almost invisible. That was the problem. Brooke never hit Mason. She never shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. There were no bruises, no broken objects, no dramatic scenes that would have forced Tyler to intervene. What Brooke did was quieter, more precise. She controlled the atmosphere. Noise irritated her. Questions exhausted her. Needs, especially from a child who wasn't hers, felt like an intrusion. Mason learned this the same way he learned everything else in that house, by paying attention. One evening, Mason dropped a fork. It clattered against the kitchen floor, the sound sharp in the silence. Brooke's head snapped toward him. "Really?" she said, her voice tight. "Can you be careful for once?" Mason froze, heat rising to his face. "Sorry," he whispered, already bending down to pick it up. Brooke shook her head. "Honestly, I've had a long day." Tyler wasn't there to hear it. He was working late. Mason knew better than to bring it up later. It wasn't serious enough. It wasn't worth the trouble. That became the pattern. When Mason took too long in the bathroom, Brooke knocked sharply on the door. "Some of us need to use that, you know." When he asked for help with homework, she exhaled loudly. "Didn't you learn this already?" When he complained of being tired, she glanced at him skeptically. "You're 12, not 80. The worst moments came when Mason mentioned pain. A headache, a sore throat, a tight feeling in his chest he didn't know how to describe. Each time, Brooke reacted the same way. Not with concern, but with suspicion. "You're fine," she'd say. "Don't start. Or worse, don't make a big deal out of nothing." Once, when Mason said his stomach hurt and he didn't feel well enough to eat dinner, Brooke laughed lightly. Funny how kids always get sick when they don't like what's for dinner. Mason forced himself to eat. Children are extraordinarily good at adapting to emotional climates. Mason quickly learned which version of Brooke he would get and when. If Tyler was home, Brooke was gentle, almost affectionate. She asked Mason how his day had been. She reminded him to do his chores with a smile. Tyler saw these moments and felt reassured. She's good with him, Tyler told himself. She just has high standards. When Tyler wasn't home, Brooke became efficient and cold. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She simply withdrew warmth, replacing it with an unspoken rule: do not need anything. Mason understood that rule better than anyone. He began to organize his life around avoiding Brooke's attention. He stayed in his room. He moved quietly. He learned how to open and close doors without making a sound. He monitored his own body, suppressing hunger, ignoring discomfort, convincing himself that pain was something to be managed privately. This is how emotional neglect works. It doesn't announce itself. It teaches a child that their feelings are inconvenient, that their body is unreliable, that asking for help is a moral failure. From the outside, Mason appeared even more well-behaved than before. Teachers praised his focus. Tyler noticed how little Mason complained. He took it as a sign that his son was adjusting well. What a strong kid, people said. Strength, in this house, meant silence. Brooke never explicitly told Mason not to ask for help. She didn't have to. Her reactions trained him more effectively than words ever could. Each eye roll, each sigh, each dismissive comment reinforced the same lesson. Don't bother me. Don't exaggerate. Don't be weak. One afternoon, Mason came home from school with a pounding headache. The lights in the kitchen felt too bright. His head throbbed behind his eyes. He stood there for a moment, considering whether to say anything. Brooke was at the counter, scrolling on her phone. My head hurts, Mason said quietly. She didn't look up. Drink some water. It really hurts, he added, testing the boundary. She finally glanced at him, irritation flashing across her face. Mason, I am not dealing with this right now. Go lie down. That was the end of the conversation. Mason went to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, tears gathering in his eyes. He didn't cry loudly. He pressed his lips together and waited for the pain to pass. It did, eventually, but the lesson stayed. By the time the pimple appeared on his cheek, weeks later, Mason's internal rules were firmly in place. Pain was not an emergency. Pain was not something adults wanted to hear about. Pain was something to push through quietly. When he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw the redness on his face, his first instinct was not fear of infection, it was fear of reaction. What would Brooke say? Don't be dramatic, don't pretend to be sick, don't make trouble. Mason touched the spot gently and winced. He looked at himself for a long moment, then reached for his hoodie. Covering it felt safer than explaining it. That was the tragedy of the Reed household. Not that Brooke was openly cruel, not that Tyler was intentionally neglectful, but that together they created an environment where a child learned that survival depended on invisibility. No one told Mason not to ask for help. They simply taught him that asking wasn't worth it. And so when his body began to send warning signals, real ones, dangerous ones, Mason did exactly what he had been trained to do. He stayed quiet. The pimple appeared on a Monday morning. Mason noticed it while brushing his teeth, half awake, his mind still drifting between sleep and the day ahead. At first he thought it was just a shadow. He leaned closer to the mirror, tilting his face slightly. There it was, small, red, raised just enough to catch the light on his left cheek. It didn't look dramatic. It wasn't large or angry the way pimples sometimes were. But when Mason pressed it gently with the tip of his finger, a sharp pain shot inward, deeper than he expected. He pulled his hand back immediately, his heart beating faster. That surprised him. Most things that hurt him didn't feel like that. This pain wasn't on the surface. It felt buried, like it was coming from somewhere underneath his skin. Mason stared at his reflection for a long moment. He looked tired. His eyes seemed duller than usual, the skin beneath them faintly shadowed. He wondered if anyone else would notice. He wondered if they would care. He thought briefly about telling his father. Tyler was already downstairs, moving quickly, keys in hand, checking his phone. Mornings were rushed. Tyler liked efficiency. He liked problems that could be solved quickly. Mason imagined pointing to his cheek, explaining that it hurt. He imagined Tyler glancing at it for half a second. It's just a pimple, Tyler would probably say. "You'll be fine." Tyler wouldn't mean to dismiss him. He never did. But Mason knew how easily small concerns slipped through the cracks of adult attention. Brooke was in the kitchen too, sipping coffee. She glanced at Mason as he entered, her eyes flicking to his face and then away. For a split second, Mason thought she might say something. She didn't. He was grateful for that. Mason grabbed his hoodie from the back of the chair and pulled it on, adjusting the hood so it cast a faint shadow over his cheek. It was already warm outside. Houston summers didn't ease up for anyone. Within minutes he could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck. He ignored it. At school, the pain followed him like a quiet companion. It pulsed gently at first, then more insistently as the hours passed. When he rested his cheek against his hand during class, the pressure made his eyes water. He shifted, pretending to stretch, pretending nothing was wrong. A boy sitting across from him noticed. "What's on your face?" he asked, squinting. Mason shrugged. "Nothing." The word came easily. It always did. By lunchtime, the area around the pimple felt hot, not warm. Hot. Mason avoided chewing on that side of his mouth. He stuck to softer foods and swallowed carefully. No one paid attention. No one ever did. That afternoon, the hoodie became unbearable. His shirt clung to his skin. His head felt heavier than usual. When the final bell rang, Mason felt relief. Not because the pain had eased, but because he could go home and stop pretending. At home, Brooke was already irritated. Something had gone wrong with her day. Mason could tell by the way she moved, by the sharp clatter of dishes in the sink. He retreated to his room without saying a word. In the privacy of the bathroom, he studied his cheek again. The redness had spread slightly. The skin looked tighter, shinier. He touched it and hissed softly as pain flared. This time, fear crept in. Not panic, not yet. Just a quiet unease, like the feeling before a storm. Mason considered his options the way an adult might, carefully weighing risk against consequence. Option 1, tell someone. Risk, being dismissed, annoyed, accused of exaggerating. Option 2, wait. Painful but familiar. Waiting had always worked before. He washed his face gently, hoping that would help. The water stung. He dried his skin carefully, then stepped back and looked at himself again. The boy in the mirror looked uncertain, smaller somehow. That night, Mason lay in bed and tried to sleep. The pain throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Each pulse felt deeper than the last, as if something inside his cheek was pressing outward. He shifted positions, pressing his pillow against the other side of his face. In the darkness, he thought about the times he had spoken up and regretted it. The sighs, the eye rolls, the subtle messages that said, "This is not important." He decided he would give it one more day, just one. By morning, the pain was worse. The pimple had grown slightly, the skin around it inflamed. Mason felt warm, though he didn't check his temperature. He didn't want to know. Knowing might mean having to explain. At breakfast, he barely touched his food. Brooke noticed. "You're not hungry now?" she said. "That's new." "My face hurts," Mason said, barely above a whisper. It was the most he had allowed himself to say. Brooke looked at him, really looked this time, then frowned. "It's just a pimple," she said. "Don't start acting sick over something like that." Something inside Mason sank. He nodded, eyes downcast. Okay. That was the moment he made his decision. If adults weren't going to take it seriously, then he wouldn't either. He would handle it himself. Children often believe that if they can fix a problem quietly, they can avoid causing trouble. Mason had fixed many things on his own before. He had learned to tie his own wounds emotionally. This felt no different. By that evening, the pain had become constant. It radiated downward, toward his jaw. His head felt light. His body felt heavy. Standing in the bathroom, staring at his reflection, Mason made a choice that would change everything. He leaned closer to the mirror, his hands trembling slightly. If no one else was going to help him, he would do it himself. Mason waited until the house was quiet. Tyler wasn't home yet. Brooke was in the living room, the television murmuring softly in the background. Mason could hear the faint clink of ice in her glass, the low sound of her laughter at something on the screen. She was relaxed, occupied. This was the safest moment he was going to get. He slipped into the bathroom and closed the door carefully, turning the lock with a soft click. He flipped on the light and leaned over the sink, gripping its edge with both hands. His reflection stared back at him, pale and tense. The pimple on his cheek looked angrier now, redder, swollen, the skin stretched tight and shiny. It hurt just to look at it. Mason swallowed and reached for a tissue, folding it over his fingers the way he had seen people do in movies. His hands were shaking. He told himself to breathe. He told himself this was simple. People did this all the time. It would hurt for a second, then it would be over. No more questions, no more explanations. He pressed gently at first. Pain flared instantly, sharp and deep, nothing like the surface sting he had expected. Mason gasped and pulled his hand back, eyes watering. His heart pounded in his ears. For a moment he considered stopping, waiting, unlocking the door and telling someone that something was wrong. He thought of Brooke's face, her voice. "Don't make a big deal out of nothing." He tried again, harder this time. His fingers pressed in from both sides, nails digging into his skin. The pain exploded, white-hot, radiating inward and downward. Mason cried out despite himself, a small broken sound that barely made it past his lips. He froze, listening, terrified Brooke might hear. The television continued playing. Mason pressed again, desperate now, teeth clenched, tears streaming down his face. There was a sudden release. A thick, foul-smelling fluid burst onto the tissue, more than he expected, more than he'd ever seen before. Mason recoiled, his stomach lurching. For a split second he felt relief. Then the pain came back, worse. His cheek began to throb violently, as if something inside it were burning. Heat spread under his skin, crawling along his jaw. Mason dropped the tissue into the sink and turned on the water, rinsing his face frantically. The water stung like acid. He cried openly now, shoulders shaking, trying to keep his sobs quiet. When he looked back in the mirror, his face had changed. The swelling had increased, ballooning outward. The skin around the spot was darkening, the redness spreading unevenly. Mason touched it and nearly screamed. The pain felt deeper now, not just in his cheek but along his jaw, as if it were drilling into the bone. Something was very wrong. Mason stumbled back into his bedroom, dizzy, his head spinning. He lay down on his bed, curling onto his side, pressing his pillow against the opposite cheek. His body felt hot and cold at the same time. His heart raced. Every breath felt shallow. He told himself it would pass. He had told himself that before. Minutes stretched into hours. The pain did not fade. It intensified. His cheek felt tight, stretched to its limit. His jaw ached so badly he could barely open his mouth. When he swallowed, pain shot up into his ear. By the time Tyler came home, Mason was shaking. Brooke knocked on his door once, sharp and impatient. "Dinner," she called. "If you're going to eat." Mason tried to answer. His voice wouldn't cooperate. He swallowed and forced out a weak, "I'm not hungry." Brooke opened the door without waiting for permission. She stopped short when she saw him. Mason was curled on his bed, his face flushed, sweat dampening his hair. His cheek was visibly swollen now, the skin stretched tight and shiny. Brooke frowned, not with concern, with annoyance. "What did you do to your face?" she asked. Mason tried to sit up. The movement made his vision blur. "It hurts," he whispered. Brooke crossed her arms. "I told you not to mess with it," she said. "You probably made it worse." Mason nodded weakly, guilt flooding him. Of course it was his fault. It always was. "You don't need a hospital for a pimple," Brooke added. "Just lie down. You'll be fine." She closed the door behind her. Mason lay there, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting in and out. The pain was relentless now, a constant crushing pressure that made it hard to think. His body felt heavy, unresponsive. He shivered despite the heat. Sometime during the night, fever dreams took hold. Faces blurred together. Voices echoed, distorted and distant. He thought he heard his mother calling his name. He tried to answer. No sound came out. By morning, the infection had taken control. Mason struggled to sit up, his limbs weak and uncoordinated. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His cheek was massively swollen, discolored, the redness spreading downward toward his jawline and neck in a faint, angry streak, a warning his body was screaming. Mason felt lightheaded, his heart racing. He leaned against the sink, breathing hard. His skin felt clammy. He tried to splash water on his face and nearly collapsed. He made it to the kitchen, moving slowly, carefully, each step an effort. Brooke glanced up, startled despite herself. "What happened to you?" she said. Mason opened his mouth to answer. His tongue felt thick, his words slurred. "I feel bad," he managed. Brooke hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. Then she shook her head, as if pushing the thought away. "You're overreacting," she said. "Go lie down. I'm not dealing with this right now." Mason turned back toward his room, his vision tunneling, the edges darkening. Halfway up the stairs, his legs gave out. He grabbed the railing, barely stopping himself from falling. His heart hammered wildly in his chest. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization surfaced, faint but terrifying. He had waited too long. The infection that had begun as a small, ordinary pimple was no longer contained. Bacteria had been pushed deep beneath the skin, into spaces where the body struggled to fight it. In children, infections like this do not move slowly. They surge, they overwhelm. Mason didn't know any of that. All he knew was that his body felt like it was slipping away from him, and for the first time, staying quiet no longer felt like protection. It felt like danger. By the next morning, Mason's body was no longer hiding what was happening inside it. The pain had settled into something heavier, more ominous. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was deep, constant, as if his face and jaw were wrapped in a tightening vice. His skin felt too tight, too hot, like it might split if he moved the wrong way. When he tried to sit up, dizziness washed over him, forcing him back down onto the bed. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. Brooke moving around in the kitchen, cabinets opening and closing. The familiar rhythm of a normal morning continuing as if nothing was wrong. Mason touched his cheek and immediately pulled his hand away. The swelling had spread further overnight. When he finally worked up the strength to look in the mirror, his breath caught. The left side of his face was badly swollen now, distorted, almost unrecognizable. The redness had deepened into a darker shade, stretching downward from his cheek toward his jaw. Beneath the skin, a faint red line traced its way lower, like a warning drawn directly on his body. Mason didn't know what that line meant. He only knew that it terrified him. His heart was racing even though he was barely moving. Each breath felt shallow, as if his chest couldn't fully expand. His mouth was dry. His thoughts felt slow, slippery, hard to hold on to. He stumbled into the hallway, gripping the wall for balance. Every step sent a wave of nausea through him. The house felt too bright, too loud. Brooke glanced up when she saw him. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. "What on earth happened to your face?" she asked. Mason tried to answer, but his tongue felt thick, uncooperative. "It hurts," he said. The words came out slurred, wrong. Brooke frowned, irritation quickly replacing surprise. "I told you not to mess with it," she said sharply. "Now look at it." Mason swallowed. "I feel really bad," he whispered. Brooke sighed loudly, setting her mug down. "You're not dying," she said. "You're just making yourself miserable. Go sit down." Something in Mason wanted to argue, wanted to say this was different, worse. But the familiar fear rose up, choking him. He nodded and turned away. At school, everything felt unreal. The classroom buzzed with noise, voices blending together until Mason couldn't separate them. He sat at his desk, his head throbbing, his heart pounding so fast it made him lightheaded. The pain in his jaw radiated outward, down his neck, up toward his ear. Swallowing hurt. Breathing felt wrong. His teacher noticed his face. "Mason," she said gently, "are you feeling okay?" For a moment the room seemed to tilt. This was it. This was the chance. He could say no. He could ask for help. Mason opened his mouth. "I'm okay," he said. The words came out automatically, without thought, without intention. They were the safest words he knew. The teacher hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "You don't look well." Mason nodded quickly. "I'm fine," he repeated, lowering his gaze. The teacher moved on. As the day dragged on, Mason's condition worsened. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the air conditioning. His hands trembled. When he stood up to go to the bathroom, black spots danced at the edges of his vision. In the bathroom mirror, the red line along his jaw was darker now, more defined. His skin looked stretched, glossy. He pressed his fingers against the sink, breathing hard, trying not to faint. This was no longer just pain. His entire body felt wrong, disconnected, as if it were running on borrowed energy. By the time the final bell rang, Mason could barely walk straight. He moved slowly through the hallway, bumping into lockers, apologizing automatically. Outside, the heat hit him like a wall. His heart raced even faster, struggling to keep up. At home, Brooke was on the phone when he walked in. She glanced at him briefly, then turned away, lowering her voice. Mason stood there, swaying slightly, unsure what to do. He made it halfway up the stairs before his legs buckled. He grabbed the railing just in time, collapsing onto the steps. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. His vision blurred. Brooke noticed then. "What are you doing?" she snapped, hanging up the phone. She walked over and looked down at him. Up close, the severity of his condition was impossible to miss. His face was swollen and mottled, his skin was clammy, his eyes looked unfocused, glassy. For the first time, uncertainty crept into her voice. "Get up," she said. "You're being dramatic." Mason tried. His body didn't respond. A wave of dizziness hit him so hard he nearly lost consciousness. He slumped against the stairs, his heart pounding erratically, his breaths shallow and rapid. Brooke stepped back, fear flickering behind her irritation. Not fear for Mason, fear of what this might mean for her. She pulled out her phone and stared at it, hesitating. Tyler wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. Mason's head lolled to the side. He felt cold now, despite the sweat. His thoughts drifted in and out. He dimly registered Brooke's voice, sharp and strained, as she spoke into the phone. "Something's wrong with Mason," she said. I think you need to come home." When Tyler arrived, everything changed. He barely made it through the front door before he saw his son. Mason was slumped on the stairs, his breathing labored, his face grotesquely swollen. Tyler's stomach dropped. "Oh my God," he breathed, rushing forward. "What happened?" Brooke started talking all at once, defensive, frantic. "It was just a pimple. He messed with it. I told him to lie down." Tyler didn't hear the rest. He knelt in front of Mason, cupping his son's face gently, carefully avoiding the swollen area. Mason's skin was burning hot. "Mason," Tyler said, his voice breaking. "Hey, look at me." Mason's eyes fluttered open. He tried to focus. "Dad," he whispered. Tyler's chest tightened painfully at the sound. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though the answer was already forming somewhere deep inside him. Mason swallowed with effort. "I didn't want to bother anyone." Something inside Tyler shattered. He scooped Mason up in his arms, feeling how light his son felt, how weak. He grabbed his keys with shaking hands. "We're going to the hospital," he said. Not to Brooke, not to Mason, but to himself. Right now. As he rushed out the door, Tyler's mind raced. Guilt crashed over him in heavy waves. He replayed every moment he hadn't looked closely, every time he had assumed silence meant safety. Mason lay limp against his chest, his heart racing uncontrollably, his body fighting a battle it was losing. The infection was no longer localized. It had entered his bloodstream. His body was sounding every alarm it had left, and it was running out of time. The drive to the hospital felt endless, even though Tyler ran every red light he could safely push through. Mason lay across the back seat, buckled in but slumped to one side, his head resting against the door. Tyler glanced at him every few seconds, his eyes darting between the road and his son's face. Mason's breathing was fast and shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. His lips looked pale. His skin glistened with sweat. "Stay with me, buddy," Tyler said, his voice shaking despite his effort to keep it steady. "We're almost there." Mason didn't respond. Tyler's hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. His mind raced backward, replaying the last few weeks with brutal clarity. The quiet dinners, the way Mason always said he was fine. The times Tyler had been too tired, too distracted, too eager to believe that things were finally settling down. He remembered thinking that silence meant peace. Now every mile felt like punishment for that assumption. When they reached the emergency room, Tyler barely parked the car. He jumped out, yanked open the back door, and lifted Mason into his arms. Mason felt alarmingly light, his body limp against Tyler's chest. "Help!" Tyler shouted as he burst through the ER doors. "My son! Something's wrong with my son!" Nurses moved instantly. A gurney appeared. Hands reached for Mason, transferring him quickly but carefully. Tyler followed, his heart pounding, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "How long has he been like this?" a nurse asked as they rushed down the hallway. I don't know," Tyler said, the words tasting bitter. "A few days. It started as a pimple." The nurse's expression tightened. Mason was wheeled into a curtained bay. Monitors were attached to his chest. A blood pressure cuff tightened around his arm. A thermometer beeped sharply. "High fever," someone said. "Heart rate's elevated. Blood pressure's dropping," another voice added. Tyler stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching strangers surround his son, watching them speak in clipped, efficient phrases that sounded terrifyingly urgent. He felt useless, helpless. A doctor approached him, calm but serious. "Your son is very sick," she said. We suspect a severe infection. We're going to run blood tests and get imaging right away." "Is he going to be okay?" Tyler asked. The doctor hesitated just long enough for Tyler to notice. "We're doing everything we can," she said carefully. They wheeled Mason away for scans, leaving Tyler alone with his thoughts for the first time since he had seen his son collapse on the stairs. He sank into a chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably now that he no longer had to be strong. He thought of the question Mason had never asked out loud. "Is this bad enough to be worth the trouble?" Tyler pressed his palms into his eyes, fighting the burn of tears. He realized with sickening clarity that Mason hadn't been quiet because he was okay. He had been quiet because he was afraid. Afraid of being dismissed. Afraid of being a problem. Afraid of not being believed. Afraid because Tyler had not made it safe for him to speak. When the doctor returned, she was holding a tablet, her expression grave. "The infection has spread," she said. "It's no longer just in the soft tissue. It's affecting the jawbone." Tyler stared at her. "The bone?" She nodded. "We're also seeing signs of sepsis. His body is reacting aggressively to the infection." The words hit him like physical blows. "We need to act fast," the doctor continued. "He'll need surgery, possibly extensive." Tyler nodded numbly. He would have agreed to anything, signed anything, given anything. His mind latched onto one thought and one thought only. "Please don't let me lose him." Mason was moved to the ICU. Tubes, wires, machines surrounded him. Antibiotics were started through and 4 powerful ones meant to fight an infection that had already gained too much ground. Tyler sat by the bed, holding Mason's hand, feeling how hot his skin was. "I'm here," Tyler whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Mason stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open for a brief moment. They were unfocused, glassy. "Dad?" he murmured. "Yes," Tyler said quickly, leaning closer. "I'm right here." "I'm sorry," Mason whispered. The words pierced Tyler's heart. "What are you sorry for?" Tyler asked, his voice breaking. "For being trouble," Mason said faintly, before his eyes closed again. Tyler bowed his head, unable to stop the tears now. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, heavy and unforgiving. He had thought providing a house, food, and structure was enough. He had thought that if Mason wasn't complaining, then nothing was wrong. He had been wrong. Hours passed in a blur of updates and waiting. Doctors came and went. Nurses adjusted medications. Machines continued their steady beeping, indifferent to Tyler's growing panic. Finally, the surgeon arrived. "We need to take him to the operating room," he said. "The infection has caused significant damage. We'll need to drain the abscess and assess the bone." "How much damage?" Tyler asked. The surgeon met his eyes. "We won't know until we're in there." As Mason was prepared for surgery, Tyler stood outside the operating room doors, his arms wrapped around himself. The hallway was cold, sterile, unforgiving. He stared at the closed doors, knowing that everything hinged on what happened on the other side. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen. Hannah. For a moment he hesitated. Pride, resentment, old anger flared instinctively. Then he remembered Mason's small voice apologizing for being trouble. Tyler answered. "Hannah," he said hoarsely. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "Is Mason okay?" Tyler closed his eyes. "No," he said. "He's really not." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. "I'm coming," Hannah said. "Tell me where you are." As Tyler hung up, he realized something else with painful clarity. If he had looked sooner, if he had listened sooner, if he had questioned the silence instead of trusting it, they wouldn't be here. The doors to the operating room remained closed, and all Tyler could do was wait, surrounded by the echoes of choices he could no longer change. The ICU swallowed time. Tyler lost track of minutes, then hours, sitting in the hard plastic chair outside Mason's room. Nurses moved in and out with quiet urgency, their shoes whispering against the polished floor. Every so often, one of them would glance at Tyler with a look that was practiced, professional, and still full of gravity. The kind of look that told you something was very wrong, even if no one had said it yet. Inside the room, Mason lay motionless, surrounded by machines that now seemed far too large for his small body. Tubes ran from his arms, wires crossed his chest. The steady beeping of the monitor had become the soundtrack of Tyler's fear. Each sound confirmed that Mason was still here. Each pause sent panic shooting through him. A nurse adjusted the 4 and spoke softly to Mason, even though he didn't respond. Tyler noticed that. The way medical staff talked to unconscious patients, as if they could hear everything, as if being present still mattered. He wondered how long it had been since he had spoken to his own son that way. The doctor returned with the results of the blood work. Tyler stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "His white blood cell count is extremely high," she said. "That tells us his body is fighting a serious infection." Tyler nodded, though his mind struggled to keep up. "The antibiotics, are they helping?" "We've started broad-spectrum antibiotics," she said carefully. "But the infection is advanced. We need imaging to see exactly how far it's spread." Mason was taken for a CT scan shortly after. Tyler wasn't allowed to go with him. He watched as they wheeled the bed down the hallway, Mason's head wrapped in gauze, his face swollen and distorted. Tyler felt a surge of helpless anger, at himself, at the situation, at the fact that something so small had led them here. He paced while he waited, his phone heavy in his hand. Hannah was on her way. He hadn't told Brooke to come. He wasn't sure what he would say to her now. When the doctor finally returned, she wasn't alone. A surgeon stood beside her, his expression serious, his movements deliberate. Tyler's stomach tightened. They led him into a small consultation room. The door closed softly behind them, sealing off the rest of the world. The doctor pulled up the CT images on a screen. Black and white slices of Mason's face appeared, layered and unfamiliar. Tyler stared at them, trying to understand what he was looking at. "This area here," the doctor said, pointing, "is where the infection started." Tyler leaned closer. "From the pimple?" She nodded. "Yes." She moved her finger downward. But it didn't stay there. The room felt suddenly smaller. The infection spread into the deeper tissues, she continued. "And here," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "it has reached the jawbone." Tyler felt his breath catch. "The bone," he repeated, his voice barely audible. The surgeon stepped forward. "This is called osteomyelitis," he explained. "A bone infection. In children especially, it can progress very quickly." "And the sepsis?" Tyler asked. The doctor nodded grimly. "The bacteria have entered his bloodstream. That's why his heart rate is so high and his blood pressure is unstable. His body is mounting a full inflammatory response." Tyler sank into the chair behind him, his legs suddenly weak. How did this happen?" he asked. "From a pimple?" The surgeon met his eyes. When an infected area is manipulated, squeezed or punctured, it can push bacteria deeper into spaces where the body has a harder time fighting it. The face is especially dangerous because of how closely connected everything is. Tyler closed his eyes. "So what do we do?" he asked. The answer came after a pause that felt endless. "We have to operate," the surgeon said, "immediately." "Operate," Tyler repeated. "On his face?" "Yes," the surgeon said. "We need to drain the infection and remove any dead tissue. If the bone is involved, we may have to remove part of it to stop the spread." Tyler's heart pounded painfully. "You're saying you might have to take out part of his jaw?" The surgeon didn't look away. "If we don't, the infection could continue to spread. This is about saving his life." Saving his life. The words echoed in Tyler's mind, drowning out everything else. He nodded slowly, mechanically. "Do whatever you have to do," he said. "Please." The doctor placed a consent form in front of him. Tyler barely read it. His hands shook as he signed his name. As they prepared Mason for surgery, Tyler was allowed to sit with him for a few moments. He took Mason's hand, feeling how small it was in his own. "I'm here," Tyler whispered again, the words feeling both vital and painfully inadequate. "I should have been here sooner. I'm so sorry." Mason didn't respond, but his fingers twitched faintly, as if in acknowledgement. When they wheeled Mason toward the operating room, Tyler followed until he was stopped by a set of double doors. He stood there, watching as they disappeared through them, the doors closing with a soft final click. That was when Hannah arrived. She looked like she had run the entire way. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She spotted Tyler instantly. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice breaking. Tyler swallowed. "In surgery." Hannah pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over immediately. "What happened?" Tyler hesitated. There were 1,000 answers to that question, layered and tangled. He chose the simplest one. "He was sick," Tyler said, "and no one realized how bad it was." Hannah sank into the chair beside him, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. Tyler sat next to her, the space between them filled with shared terror and regret. For the first time in years, there was no anger between them. No blame spoken out loud, only the truth. They waited together as time stretched unbearably thin. Inside the operating room, surgeons worked quickly and carefully. Incisions were made, pus was drained, tissue was examined. And when they reached the jawbone, the worst was confirmed. The infection had eaten into it. The decision was made without ceremony. There was no debate, no hesitation. To save Mason's life, part of the infected bone had to be removed. Outside, Tyler and Hannah sat side by side, unaware of the exact moment when that decision was carried out. They only knew that their son's life was hanging in the balance, decided by hands they had entrusted with everything. The surgery lasted hours. When the surgeon finally emerged, his mask pulled down, his eyes tired but focused, Tyler stood up so fast he nearly fell. "He's alive," the surgeon said first. Tyler's knees nearly gave out in relief, but, the surgeon continued, "It was extensive. We removed a portion of the infected jawbone. The infection was aggressive. We did what we had to do." Hannah covered her face and sobbed. Tyler nodded, tears streaming down his own face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for saving him." As Mason was moved back into the ICU, sedated and heavily bandaged, Tyler stared through the glass at his son, alive, scarred, changed. The cost of silence had finally been paid, and it had been far too high. Time moved differently outside the operating room. Tyler and Hannah sat side by side in the waiting area, neither of them speaking. The chairs were stiff and cold, designed for short waits, not for the kind of hours that hollowed you out from the inside. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second landing like a reminder of how little control they had left. Tyler stared at the double doors across the hall. Every time someone walked through them, his heart jumped, only to sink again when it wasn't the surgeon. Hannah sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting together until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't stopped crying completely. The tears came in waves, quiet, shaking sobs she tried to contain, failing each time. Neither of them spoke about the past, about the divorce, about the anger. None of it mattered here, not now. The only thing that existed was a 12-year-old boy on an operating table, his life balanced on decisions that could never be undone. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was controlled and precise. Bright surgical lights illuminated Mason's face, now draped and prepped, the swollen cheek marked carefully. The surgical team moved with practiced efficiency. There was no panic here, only focus. Mason's vital signs flickered across monitors, numbers rising and falling, watched closely by an anesthesiologist whose sole job was to keep him alive. The first incision released a pressure that had been building for days. Thick, infected fluid drained out, confirming what the scans had shown. The infection was deep, aggressive, far beyond what anyone would call minor. As the surgeons worked their way carefully through layers of tissue, the full extent of the damage became clear. The infection hadn't respected boundaries. It had spread along planes of tissue, following paths that only anatomy and bacteria understood. When they reached the jawbone, there was no doubt left. The bone was infected, dead in places. This was the moment surgeons are trained for but never take lightly. Bone is not removed casually, especially from a child's face. Every cut carried consequences that would follow Mason for the rest of his life. Scars, asymmetry, possible long-term effects on growth and function, but the alternative was unthinkable. If infected bone remained, the bacteria would continue to spread. More antibiotics would not be enough. Another wave of sepsis could come, stronger, faster, deadlier. There was no real choice. The surgeon made the call. Infected bone was carefully removed, piece by piece, until only healthy tissue remained. The team worked methodically, knowing that every extra second under anesthesia carried its own risks, but also knowing that stopping too soon could cost Mason everything. Outside, Tyler stood and paced, unable to sit any longer. He rubbed his hands together repeatedly, as if trying to warm them, though the room wasn't cold. His thoughts spiraled, looping back to the same unbearable question. What if he had looked sooner? He remembered Mason at the breakfast table, quiet, eyes down. Remembered the hoodie in the heat, remembered assuming that no news was good news. Hannah watched him, her own thoughts no less cruel. She remembered the night she left the house. Mason frozen on the stairs, his wide eyes. The way she had told him it would be okay, even though she hadn't believed it herself. She wondered how many times since then Mason had wanted her and hadn't been able to say it. Both parents sat with the same realization, heavy and inescapable. Their son had learned to be silent because the adults in his life were too loud with their own pain. Hours later, the doors finally opened. The surgeon stepped out, pulling off his gloves, his face tired but composed. Tyler and Hannah were on their feet instantly. He made it through the surgery, the surgeon said first. The relief hit Tyler so hard his knees nearly buckled. Hannah let out a sob that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. But it was extensive. The surgeon continued gently. The infection had damaged part of the jawbone. We removed what we had to. The goal was to save his life, and we did. Tyler nodded, tears streaming freely now. Thank you, he said hoarsely. Thank you. Hannah reached out, gripping the surgeon's sleeve for a brief second. Is he going to wake up? She asked. Is he going to be okay? He's stable, the surgeon said. The next 24 to 48 hours are critical. He'll be in the ICU, on strong antibiotics. There will be pain. There will be recovery. But he's alive. Alive. The word echoed through them both. Mason was wheeled back into the ICU, his face heavily bandaged now, tubes and lines attached to him like lifelines. He looked fragile, changed, smaller somehow. Tyler stood at the glass wall, unable to take his eyes off his son. He knew that even if Mason survived, and he had, nothing would ever go back to the way it was before. The scar would fade eventually, but the memory of this night would not. Hannah stepped closer to the bed when they were allowed inside. She reached for Mason's hand carefully, as if afraid she might hurt him. His fingers were warm now, no longer burning hot. The monitor showed a steadier rhythm. She leaned down and whispered, "Mom's here," her voice breaking. "I'm not going anywhere." Tyler watched from the other side of the bed, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and shame. The surgery had saved Mason's life, but it had also exposed something far more painful than bone and tissue. It had revealed the cost of not listening, of assuming, of believing that silence meant strength. As the machines continued their steady beeping, Tyler understood something with brutal clarity. This operation wasn't just about cutting away infection. It was about cutting away the lies they told themselves about what children need. Mason had survived the night, but the real work, the work of rebuilding trust, of making it safe for a child to speak, was only beginning. Mason woke slowly as if rising through thick water. At first there was only sensation, a dull ache, pressure, a heaviness that seemed to press down on his entire body at once. He tried to move and immediately felt resistance, something tugging at his arms, his face. Panic flickered, brief and instinctive, before exhaustion pulled him back again. Voices drifted in and out of his awareness, soft ones, measured ones. Then one voice cut through the haze, familiar in a way that made something inside his chest loosen. Mason. His eyelids fluttered, light burned behind them. He squeezed them shut again, his brow creasing beneath the bandages. "I'm here," the voice said, closer now. "You're safe. Safe." That word didn't belong to hospitals in Mason's mind. Hospitals were loud, cold, full of strangers. But this voice didn't belong to the room. It belonged to memory, to late nights, to hands brushing hair away from his forehead when he was sick as a younger child. "Mason's sweetheart," the voice whispered. He opened his eyes. The world came into focus slowly. White ceiling, blurred shapes, beeping machines. And then, just to his right, a familiar face, tear-streaked, pale, watching him as if she might stop breathing if she looked away. "Mom," Mason croaked. Hannah's breath caught sharply. She leaned forward instantly, her hand finding his, holding it gently but firmly, like she was afraid he might slip away again. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm right here. You did so good. You're safe now." Mason tried to speak again, but his throat was dry, his mouth stiff. His face felt tight, sore in a way he'd never experienced before. He became aware of the bandages then, of the heaviness on one side of his face. Fear stirred. "My face," he murmured. Hannah nodded, swallowing hard. "The doctors had to fix the infection," she said carefully. "You went through a big surgery, but you're alive. You're going to heal." Alive. Mason closed his eyes briefly, letting the words settle. His body ached everywhere now. A deep soreness layered over the sharp pain in his jaw. But beneath it all, something else registered. The pain was being seen, monitored, taken seriously. He wasn't alone with it anymore. Tyler stood on the other side of the bed, watching quietly. When Mason turned his eyes toward him, Tyler stepped closer, his face lined with exhaustion and regret. "Hey, buddy," Tyler said softly. "I'm here too." Mason nodded faintly. He didn't have the energy for much else. The hours that followed passed in fragments. Nurses checking vitals, 4 bags changed, doctors explaining things in gentle terms. Strong antibiotics flowed into Mason's body, fighting what remained of the infection. Each time someone touched him, they explained what they were doing first. That mattered. Hannah didn't leave. She sat in the chair beside Mason's bed through the night. Even when nurses told her she could go rest, she slept sitting upright, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When Mason stirred, she woke instantly. At one point, in the early hours of the morning, Mason opened his eyes again and saw her there. Still there. He didn't say anything. He just watched her breathe. Something inside him softened. In the days that followed, the danger slowly receded. Mason's fever came down. His heart rate steadied. The doctors spoke less urgently. Words like critical were replaced with stable, then improving. The pain was still intense, especially when he was awake. His jaw throbbed constantly. His face felt wrong, unfamiliar. When he was finally allowed to see himself in a mirror, Hannah stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. The bandages had been reduced but not removed completely. Even so, Mason could see enough. The swelling, the stitches, the angry red line that traced the path of what had nearly killed him. He stared silently. Hannah watched his face carefully. "It's okay to be scared," she said. "It's okay to be angry, or sad, or quiet." Mason swallowed. "It hurts," he said. "I know," Hannah replied immediately. "And that makes sense. Anyone would hurt after what you've been through." No sigh, no dismissal, no accusation, just acknowledgement. That night, Mason slept more deeply than he had in weeks. But healing wasn't only physical. Even as his body began to recover, Mason remained withdrawn. He spoke less than usual. His eyes followed people cautiously when they entered the room. Sudden noises made him flinch. When nurses approached too quickly, his shoulders tensed. The doctors explained it gently to Tyler and Hannah. Trauma didn't disappear when the infection did. Near-death experiences left marks that no scan could show. "He's been through a lot," one doctor said. "Give him time. And consistency." Consistency was something Hannah understood. She made sure Mason saw her every time he woke up. She told him when she was stepping out and when she'd be back. She didn't disappear without explanation. When he asked questions, she answered honestly, without brushing anything aside. One afternoon, while Tyler had stepped out to speak with a doctor, Mason shifted uncomfortably in bed. He hesitated, then reached for the small notepad on his bedside table. His jaw was still too stiff for long sentences. He wrote slowly, carefully. Hannah leaned in to read. "Don't let Brooke come here." The words hit her like a physical blow. Hannah's chest tightened. She looked at Mason's face, at the tension in his eyes, the fear he was trying so hard to contain. "Did she hurt you?" Hannah asked quietly. Mason shook his head slightly, then paused. He nodded once, small, uncertain. "She didn't hit me," he whispered hoarsely. "She just made me scared to say anything." Hannah felt tears sting her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't have to be scared anymore," she said. "I promise." When Tyler returned, Hannah showed him the note. Tyler went very still. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The silence, the excuses, the way Mason had folded in on himself, the words he had said in the car. "I didn't want to bother anyone." Tyler sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't see it," he said. "I should have seen it." Hannah didn't argue. "This wasn't the moment for blame. This is the moment for him," she said simply. And for the first time in a long time, both parents were finally looking at the same thing. Not their anger, not their past, but their child. Recovery did not happen all at once. It came in small, uneven steps that were easy to overlook if you didn't know what to watch for. Mason's fever stayed down. His blood pressure stabilized. The doctors spoke in calmer tones now, their visits shorter, less urgent. The word critical disappeared from his chart, replaced by phrases like "on the right track" and "responding well to treatment." But Mason himself felt far from normal. His body was weak, drained in a way he had never experienced before. Sitting up exhausted him. Walking a few steps left him breathless. His jaw ached constantly, a deep, dull pain that reminded him of what had been taken from him to keep him alive. Eating was difficult, speaking was slow. And then there was the mirror. The first time Mason was cleared to walk to the bathroom on his own, Hannah stood just outside the door, giving him space but staying close. He washed his hands, then froze when he caught his reflection. The swelling had gone down, but the damage was impossible to miss. A jagged line of stitches traced along his cheek. The skin around it was discolored, tight, still healing. His face didn't look like the one he remembered. It looked older, marked. Mason stared at himself for a long time. Hannah waited, saying nothing. Finally, Mason looked away. "Is it always going to look like this?" he asked quietly. Hannah stepped beside him, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "It's going to change," she said honestly. "Scars fade, and there are doctors who help with that too. But even if it didn't, this is the mark of you surviving." Mason nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the sink. Surviving felt complicated. In the days that followed, Hannah became a constant presence. She learned Mason's medication schedule. She asked nurses questions Tyler didn't think to ask. She noticed when Mason's breathing changed, when his hands trembled more than usual, when his eyes glazed over from pain medication. She didn't dismiss any of it. When Mason said he hurt, she believed him. When he said he was scared, she didn't rush to reassure him away from it. She sat with him in it. At night, she slept on the narrow hospital couch, a blanket pulled up to her shoulders, one arm draped over the edge so her hand could rest on Mason's bed. Mason woke several times to check that she was still there. She always was. Tyler visited every day. He brought clean clothes, books, small things Mason used to like. He tried to smile, tried to sound normal. But there was a heaviness in him now, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. He watched Mason differently. When Mason went quiet, Tyler noticed. When his shoulders tensed, Tyler stopped and asked what was wrong. Sometimes Mason answered. Sometimes he didn't. Tyler was learning not to push, but also not to ignore. One afternoon, while Hannah was speaking with a doctor, Tyler sat beside Mason's bed. Mason was tracing the pattern on his blanket with one finger, his gaze distant. "Hey," Tyler said gently, "can I ask you something?" Mason glanced up. "Okay." Tyler took a breath. "When you were sick, before the hospital, why didn't you tell me it was getting worse?" Mason didn't answer right away. His finger kept moving, slower now. "I thought I was supposed to handle it," he said finally. "I didn't want to make things harder." Tyler swallowed. "Harder for who?" Mason hesitated. "Everyone." The word landed between them, heavy and undeniable. Tyler nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have made it clear that you never have to protect us. That's my job." Mason studied his father's face, searching for something. Whatever he found there seemed to ease him slightly. He nodded once. Recovery meant more conversations like that. Not dramatic ones, quiet ones, honest ones, the kind that slowly rebuild what had been broken. As Mason grew stronger, the doctors began talking about discharge. Not home yet, but soon. Physical therapy was discussed. Follow-up surgeries were mentioned. Possible reconstruction later in life. Long-term antibiotics. Careful monitoring. Hannah listened to every word. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hospital room in soft orange light, Mason reached for the notepad again. His jaw was still stiff, and writing felt easier. He drew instead. It was a simple picture. A hospital bed, a small figure lying in it, and beside it, a woman sitting in a chair, leaning forward, her hand resting on the bed. Underneath, in careful, uneven letters, Mason wrote, "She stayed." Hannah covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling freely now. She pulled Mason into a careful hug, mindful of the tubes and sore places, holding him as close as she safely could. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered into his hair. When the day finally came for Mason to leave the ICU, he moved slowly, unsteadily, supported on both sides. The hallway felt long, overwhelming. Sounds echoed too loudly. His heart raced with the unfamiliar freedom, but Hannah was there, and Tyler, walking with him. Matching his pace, recovery, Mason was learning, wasn't about going back to the way things were. It was about building something safer, something quieter, something honest. Going home was supposed to feel like the end of something. For Mason, it felt like the beginning of learning how to exist again. The day he was discharged, the hospital staff moved carefully around him, explaining instructions in calm, deliberate voices, medication schedules, follow-up appointments, warning signs that could not be ignored. Words like infection, fever, swelling, red streaks, and confusion were repeated more than once, not as fear tactics, but as boundaries drawn clearly for the future. Mason sat quietly in a wheelchair, thinner now, his movements slow and deliberate. The stitches along his cheek were still visible, angry and pink against pale skin. He kept one hand resting lightly against his jaw, not because it hurt more than usual, but because it reminded him where his body had almost failed him. Or rather, where no one had listened in time. When they stepped outside, the Texas heat wrapped around them instantly. Mason blinked against the brightness, the open space feeling overwhelming after so many days inside white walls. Hannah walked beside him, one hand on the back of the wheelchair. Tyler walked on the other side, careful not to rush, matching Mason's pace exactly. No one spoke. They didn't need to. At home, everything looked the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet that Mason remembered. And yet nothing felt the same at all. Brooke was gone. Tyler hadn't explained it in detail, and Mason hadn't asked. He only knew that the house felt different the moment he crossed the threshold. Lighter, safer. The air no longer felt tense, as if one wrong movement might trigger irritation. Mason moved slowly through the rooms, noticing small things he hadn't realized he'd been avoiding before. The sound of his own footsteps, the way doors closed without him flinching, the way no one sighed when he needed to sit down. Hannah stayed. That was the most important change. She set up a space for him on the couch, pillows arranged carefully to support his head and jaw. She kept track of his medications, waking him gently when it was time. She watched his face, his breathing, his color. Not with anxiety, but with attention. When Mason said something hurt, she didn't question it. When he said he was tired, she didn't push him. When he went quiet, she didn't disappear. Tyler noticed all of it. He noticed how Mason spoke more when he wasn't afraid of being dismissed. How his shoulders relaxed when Hannah entered the room. How the silence that remained now felt different. Not forced, not defensive, but chosen. One evening, as the sun set and the house filled with soft shadows, Mason sat at the table with a box of crayons Hannah had brought him. His hands moved slowly, carefully. His jaw still ached, and he tired easily, but he focused, intent. When he finished, he slid the paper across the table toward Hannah. It was another drawing. Simple again. A boy lying in a bed, a woman sitting beside him. This time the background wasn't a hospital room. It was a house. Underneath, Mason had written, "She stayed." Hannah pressed her lips together, tears welling despite her effort to stay composed. She reached across the table and pulled Mason into a careful embrace, holding him as if she were anchoring him to something solid. Tyler watched from a few steps away, his chest tight. That drawing said everything he hadn't wanted to admit. Hannah had made mistakes. Serious ones. Choices that had fractured their family and hurt their child. But when Mason lay between life and death, none of that mattered. What mattered was who showed up, who ran toward the hospital in the middle of the night, who stayed awake in a chair, night after night, who listened without dismissing, without sighing, without looking away. In the weeks that followed, Mason continued to heal, slowly, unevenly. The scar on his cheek faded from red to pink, then to a softer line that would likely never disappear completely. His jaw remained stiff. Some days were harder than others, and emotionally the recovery took longer. There were moments when Mason startled at loud noises, moments when he hesitated before speaking, old habits resurfacing. But now, something was different. When he spoke, someone listened. Doctors explained later what had happened in clear terms. A pimple by itself was rarely dangerous, but the face was a high-risk area. Infection there could spread quickly, especially when squeezed or punctured. In children, warning signs could escalate fast. Redness spreading, fever, rapid heart rate, confusion, extreme fatigue. The message was simple. When those signs appear, you don't wait. You don't minimize. You don't tell a child to lie down and see if it passes. You go. But the deeper lesson of Mason's story had nothing to do with medicine. It had to do with listening. Adults often believe they will hear pain when it matters, that children will cry, complain, demand attention. But many children don't. Some children learn that silence keeps the peace, that being easy is safer than being honest, that asking for help makes them a problem. Those children don't stop feeling pain, they just stop showing it. Mason didn't nearly lose his life because of a pimple. He nearly lost his life because he didn't believe he was allowed to say, "I need help." And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from a home where adults were overwhelmed, distracted, rebuilding their own lives, and mistook quiet for resilience. People say divorce frees adults from unhappy marriages. What they don't say enough is this: children don't get freed. They get carried along. They absorb the tension. They adapt. They learn to survive in silence, and sometimes that silence almost kills them. Hannah had been far from perfect. But when Mason needed someone most, her response wasn't hesitation or analysis. It was instinct. She stayed. She listened. She didn't leave. And that, more than surgery or medicine or machines, is what gave Mason a chance to heal, because when everything else falls apart, when fear takes over, when a child doesn't have the words, when the body is failing, there is one truth that remains stubbornly, painfully clear. No one loves a child with the same instinct as a mother.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.